A tea Thanksgiving dinner, my mother smiled coldly. You have your share. Be grateful. As Rayla TVs laughed, I stared at the soup. The color looked off. Slowly put my spoon down. My sister glanced at me and smirked. If you're not having IT, I will. Thanks. She took a sip, and in that moment, my mother shot up. Wait, that's... As Emily Brown drove her rental car along the snow-dusted roads of suburban Boston, she tried to suppress the anxiety swelling in her chest. Outside the window, once familiar scenery gradually appeared: rows of maple trees, the red brick library, and the park she often visited as a child. Though everything remained unchanged, she felt as if the home she should return to no longer existed. It had been 3 years since her last visit. Though it was for her father Jonathan's 3rd memorial service, Emily had her reasons for staying away so long. She'd used her busy job at the New York Museum as an excuse, but the truth was that since that day, she felt she no longer had anything she could call home. Stopping the car in front of her family house, Emily caught her breath. The stone-paved path to the entrance was completely redone, and the old rose bushes her father had tenderly nurtured were gone. In their place were geometrically arranged modern plantings in stainless steel planters. It looked like a different house entirely. Emily, you've finally arrived. The door opened, and her mother Victoria appeared. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive-looking cashmere sweater were a far cry from her mother's former modest appearance as a teacher. It's been a while. Emily exchanged an awkward hug with her mother. Richard, Emily's here. Her mother called into the house. Richard Sterling, her stepfather, emerged from the living room with the dignified bearing of a businessman, and quickly approached, placing his hands on Emily's shoulders. Hello, Emily. Finally we meet. Your mother has been worried about you. Emily didn't miss the hint of reproach lurking behind his words. His tone suggested she was a disappointing daughter. And Emily inwardly shuddered at the touch of his hands. Work has been busy, she answered briefly as she stepped into the entrance hall. There, another shock awaited her. The once warm wooden interior had been completely renovated into a cold, modern design of marble and glass. Many of the family photos that had hung on the walls were gone, replaced by abstract art and photos that clearly featured only Richard and her mother. Isn't the house lovely? It's Richard's taste, her mother said proudly. Although the house was left by Jonathan, your father, we had to update it to match the times. At those words, Emily felt as if a hole had opened in her chest. The way her mother started to say her father's name, then corrected herself to your father, gave Emily the sense that something had been irreparably broken. Emily, you finally came. Her sister Natalie came rushing down the stairs. She appeared as perfectly put together as an Instagram post. A designer dress, brand name accessories, and glossy hair. You look well, Emily said as she embraced her sister. Of course. But you're the same as always. Natalie looked Emily up and down, her designer sweater and jeans, and sniffed slightly. Is that the fashion in New York? Emily just smiled instead of responding. She knew her sister's words concealed her usual competitiveness. Let me take your luggage to your room, Richard offered. Natalie, help your sister. When Emily carried her own bags upstairs, she found her former room transformed beyond recognition. The warm yellow wallpaper and mementos from her student days were gone, replaced by an impersonal space like a hotel room. We cleared out your room, her mother said from behind. Since you don't live here anymore, we're using it as a guest room. The matter-of-fact way her mother said this left Emily speechless. Her own room where she had spent over 20 years, so easily erased in just 3 years. Is Dad's study still here? Emily suddenly thought to ask. Her mother's expression stiffened momentarily. Yes, though Richard is using it now. Emily set down her luggage and quickly headed toward the end of the hallway. Opening the door to her father's study, she found modern office furniture in place of her father's antique pieces. The books that had once filled the walls were mostly gone, the remainder arranged as mere decoration. We donated most of Jonathan's old books. Richard appeared behind her and said, he would have appreciated the social contribution. Emily swallowed her words. Many of her father's books were rare historical texts, vital treasures for his research. What about the antiques? She asked with a trembling voice. Those too. We needed the space, Richard answered nonchalantly. That night, unable to sleep, Emily slipped into the study. She thought there might still be traces of her father. As she opened drawers, she found a memo hidden in an old document case. Numbers and letters written in her father's handwriting. It looked like some kind of code. Emily slipped it into her pocket. The next day, Thanksgiving Eve, her Aunt Martha and cousin David arrived. Martha, her father's sister, seemed speechless at the changes to the house. Victoria, it's like a completely different house, Martha said quietly. Times move on, Martha, her mother smiled coldly. David drew Emily out to the garden. As a lawyer, he was usually calm and composed, but today he was visibly disturbed. "Emily, I want to ask you something. There are suspicious aspects to your father's estate distribution," he said in a low voice. "I've found evidence that some of your father's foundation funds have been diverted to Richard's real estate projects." Emily caught her breath. "That's possibly illegal. At the very least, contrary to your father's wishes." David continued with a serious expression. "He established the foundation to preserve historical buildings. If that money is being used to build new high-rise condos." Emily realized what had been happening during the 3 years she had kept her distance, and she had an intuitive feeling that something would happen at tomorrow's Thanksgiving dinner. "Is something happening tomorrow?" Emily asked. "Mother said Richard has an important announcement." David pressed his lips together. "I think it's the announcement of Richard's major project. The Old Mill District redevelopment plan." A coldness spread through Emily's chest. The Old Mill District was a place her father had spent his life working to preserve. "If Dad were alive, he would never allow it," she whispered. David patted Emily's shoulder lightly. "Isn't that why you came back? Because you sensed something?" Emily nodded. Her intuition had been correct. 3 years after her father's death, while she had stayed away, his legacy and ideals had been slowly eroded. Thanksgiving Day. Snow was falling quietly outside the window, while anxiety swirled inside Emily. She unconsciously stroked the pendant around her neck, a bronze replica of an ancient Greek coin, a keepsake from her father. "Don't you have something more formal to wear today?" Victoria, who had entered the living room, looked Emily up and down, scrutinizing her simple dress. "This is fine, Mother," Emily answered in a calm voice. "It's Dad's favorite color." Her mother's expression stiffened for a moment, then quickly recovered. "Jonathan is in the past. Today is Richard's important day." From the kitchen came the sounds of catering staff busily working. Emily realized her mother no longer cooked herself. It seemed the only dish her mother was preparing herself was the soup appetizer. "Did you make your special corn chowder?" Emily asked, and her mother smiled. "Yes, it's your favorite, isn't it? I made it especially for you." Despite feeling something off about her words, Emily nodded. It was unusual for her mother to do something for her. In the parlor, Richard was chatting with several men who appeared to be business partners. Their conversation paused briefly as they looked at Emily. "Emily, so this is the daughter I've heard about," one gray-haired man greeted her. "Richard tells me you work at a museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts," Emily answered with a smile. Right, a small museum," Richard cut in. "I've been thinking of introducing you to an opportunity to work somewhere bigger." Emily just smiled without arguing. She sensed something behind his words. In the dining room, an elaborate table setting had been arranged, with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. What had once been a simple family Thanksgiving had become a spectacle. Aunt Martha and Cousin David entered, exchanging glances with Emily. David quietly asked, "Found anything?" "I decoded Dad's memo. I placed a recording device under the seats," Emily whispered back. Natalie appeared in a flashy dress, chatting like a flower among Richard's business partners. Emily watched her sister's radiant figure, wondering how much she understood of the situation. "Everyone, it's time for dinner." Richard's voice echoed throughout the room, and the guests took their seats. Next to Emily sat David and Aunt Martha. Across from them sat her mother, Richard, and Natalie. "Let's start with a warm soup," her mother said, and maids brought in silver soup bowls. Looking at the soup placed before her, Emily faltered for a moment. It was noticeably lighter in color than the corn chowder served to everyone else. "You have yours too. Be grateful," her mother said quietly with a cold smile. That expression sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Let's eat," Richard declared, and everyone picked up their spoons. While relatives chatted amicably, Emily stared at her soup. On the night her father died, her mother had also served a special soup. That memory came back vividly. "Sis, you're making that critical face again," Natalie teased. "You're always so grumpy, even though we have such a good life thanks to Richard." Emily silently smiled and secretly took out her smartphone to photograph the soup. "Tonight is a special night," Richard said, raising his glass. "After dinner, I have an important announcement for everyone. You might be particularly interested, Emily." Meeting his meaningful gaze, Emily responded without flinching. "I'm looking forward to it." As the table conversation continued, Emily dipped her spoon in the soup and checked the smell. Something smelled different than usual. She quietly set her spoon aside. "Sis, always so critical," Natalie said maliciously. "If you're not going to eat it, I'll take it." "Thanks." With that, Natalie pulled Emily's bowl toward herself. Emily tried to stop her but wasn't fast enough. Natalie took a sip of the soup. Emily's gaze turned to her mother and Richard, and their expressions froze momentarily. Emily exchanged glances with David, who casually took out his smartphone and began recording. The moment Natalie swallowed the soup, her mother suddenly stood up. Wait. That's her mother's scream like voice dominated the table. Richard confronted her with, "What have you done?" The table fell silent, and all eyes focused on Natalie. Her expression gradually changed. First confusion, then gradually signs of pain began to appear. "My stomach hurts." Natalie moaned softly. Emily gripped her smartphone, calmly observing the situation. Confusion overtook the dining room. As Natalie grimaced and clutched her stomach, the guests began to murmur. "Are you all right?" Emily rushed to her sister's side, maintaining her composure. "Ugh, it hurts." Natalie groaned in pain, nearly slipping off her chair. Mother Victoria was in a panic, shouting, "Get the medicine box from the kitchen!" But Richard stopped her with a low voice. "Calm down, Vic," adding, "Don't call an ambulance." Emily's brow furrowed at those words. Normally one would seek medical help first thing. "What are you saying?" Aunt Martha raised her voice. "This isn't just food poisoning. We should contact a doctor immediately." As she tried to take out her cell phone, Richard quickly reached out his hand, saying, "Don't panic. It's just a stomach ache." Meanwhile, Natalie's condition was worsening. Cold sweat appeared on her forehead, and her face turned pale. "Sis's soup, what was it?" Natalie looked at Emily with suffering eyes. Her gaze mixed accusation and fear. "No." Emily held her sister's hand and quietly said, "That was prepared from me." The air in the room froze. The guests' eyes moved from Emily to her mother and Richard. "What are you saying, Emily?" Her mother's voice was trembling. "It's just an accident. Natalie just had a bad food combination." But behind that excuse, her mother looked at Richard and whispered, "This was your idea." Though it was a small voice, it was audible enough in the silent room. Richard gripped her mother's arm tightly and said harshly in her ear, "Don't ruin this important night." Then he turned to the guests with a smile and said, "It's just food poisoning. No need to worry." "I'll get some medicine," Emily said in a calm voice, and looked at David. "David, bring your laptop. Let's go to Dad's study." Leaving Natalie with Aunt Martha, the two quickly went upstairs. Entering her father's study, Emily firmly closed the door. "They planned this. I have evidence," Emily said quietly. David asked with a surprised look, "What do you mean?" Emily reached for her father's bookshelf and took out several small recording devices from a hidden storage space behind the antique books. "I planted these around the house last night." "I see." David's eyebrows raised. "You suspected from the beginning." "Dad's memo was a code," Emily continued explaining. "At first I couldn't understand its meaning, but I figured it out last night. Dates, locations, and the initials R and V. Dad was suspicious of Richard and Mom's relationship before his death, so he was gathering evidence." David began to understand. Emily opened her laptop and inserted a USB drive. "This USB contains all the data my father left, and also what was recorded from yesterday to today." The computer screen displayed multiple files. Emily clicked on the most recent recording. It was a conversation between her mother and Richard in the kitchen the night before. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Richard's voice. "Yes, everything." "But is this really necessary?" Her mother's anxious voice. "Emily has begun investigating the estate. We need to get the signatures before she starts asking questions." "But are you having second thoughts?" "Now." Richard's voice was cold. "It's been 3 years since Jonathan's death. We can't back out now." Emily and David looked at each other, conviction solidified between them. "I'll listen to the end of this conversation and play it for everyone," Emily resolved. When they returned to the living room, the situation had worsened. Natalie was lying down, her face contorted. Mother was distraught, and Richard was apologizing to his business partners while unable to hide his irritation. "I have something I'd like everyone to hear," Emily calmly announced. Everyone in the room stared at her. Emily opened her laptop and turned the speaker volume to maximum. "This was recorded in this house last night." The recording began. "Emily has started investigating the estate. If we make her sick tonight, we can avoid questions during the announcement." Richard's voice. "Is this really okay? She's my daughter." Her mother's voice. "We need to get her to sign the documents before our diversion of Jonathan's foundation funds to the project is discovered. Everything will be made public at tomorrow's announcement. There's no turning back. I'll put laxatives in her soup. It should be strong enough to keep her from catching her return flight." When the recording ended, the room was enveloped in a death-like silence. Richard's business partners exchanged glances, showing their discomfort. "This is a fabricated edit." Richard raised his voice. "Emily, you have the same delusions as your father. You're twisting the facts." But his words rang hollow. The evidence was already clear, and his panic was showing in his attitude. "Mom, is it true?" Natalie asked in a weak voice. "Did you use me?" Mother was at a loss for words and began to cry. It was for you all, for our family. Emily looked at David. He had regained his composure as a lawyer and said, "This is clearly a criminal case. There's a possibility that something more dangerous than laxatives was included. Let's call the police." Aunt Martha took out her cell phone. Richard's face twisted with anger. "Nothing has been proven. It's just a prank." Emily clutched her father's pendant and said, "This isn't over. I intend to reveal the truth to protect Dad's legacy and honor." Across the table, her eyes met Richard's. What she saw there was fear and hatred. Emily didn't flinch, meeting his gaze steadily. "Emily." Her mother began in a trembling voice, but Emily raised her hand to stop her. "It's too late, Mother." Her voice was filled with sadness, but her resolve was unwavering. "From now on, I will reveal all the truth, how Dad really died, and what you've been doing." The room was enveloped in silence. Richard's business partners began to rise from their seats with disturbed expressions. "Excuse us." "Another time," one man said, and others followed. Discomfort and doubt were visible on their faces. "Wait, Warren. This is all a misunderstanding." Richard hurriedly tried to stop them, but the man only returned a cold gaze. "We weren't looking to invest in redevelopment in a historical preservation area. We don't want to be involved in anything with legal issues." The sound of the door closing seemed to announce the end of Richard's ambitions. Red-faced, he turned to Emily. "This is a fabricated edit," Richard shouted in an angry, trembling voice. "You're just like your father, always getting in the way." Mother Victoria collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "Emily, what have you done? Are you trying to destroy our family?" Even in her suffering, Natalie was beginning to understand the truth. "Mom, is it true? Did you use me to harm Emily?" Mother was at a loss for words and covered her face with both hands. Richard said. "She just followed my instructions," Richard suddenly said, as if regaining his composure. "The responsibility is all mine. She's a weak woman." At those words her mother's face lifted, showing an expression mixed with surprise and humiliation. "That's not all," Emily said quietly, opening her father's laptop. "Dad left something else." She selected a file and pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the room. It was recorded on his final day. "Today, Richard Sterling tried again to access my research materials. What he's after is evidence of the historical value of the old mill district. He and my wife Victoria." The recording suddenly cut off there. "What's the rest of it?" Richard challenged. "There isn't any, is there?" "Jonathan couldn't prove anything. He died of a heart attack." "No one will believe you. He died of a heart attack." The resonance of those words changed the atmosphere in the room. David spoke in his lawyer's voice. "I request a reinvestigation into my uncle's cause of death and an audit of the foundation funds. There is clear evidence of embezzlement." Richard could no longer contain his panic and raised his voice. "What do you know?" Mother suddenly cried out. "Enough." She stood up and pushed back her hair with trembling hands. "Emily, your father knew about our relationship and threatened us." At those words, everyone in the room gasped. "Victoria, shut up." Richard grabbed her mother's arm, but she shook him off. "No, I want to end this," her mother said, crying. "Jonathan discovered my relationship with Richard and said he would divorce me. I was about to lose everything, my status, my reputation." Emily quietly asked, "So you killed Dad?" Silence dominated the room. The blood drained from her mother's face. "No. We were just talking, he got excited, and had a heart attack." Richard no longer had the energy to maintain appearances and showed his true nature. Jonathan was just intoxicated with his discoveries and couldn't take action. That land had the potential to change this town, but he only wanted to protect old buildings. He stared at Emily with hatred-filled eyes. Because of him, the plan was delayed for years. It was fortunate that he died. At those words, certainty was born in Emily's heart. She opened another file from her father's laptop. It was her father's research data. "This is Dad's final research." Emily showed the screen to everyone. Evidence of 18th century structures discovered under the old mill district. With this discovery, that land would unconditionally be designated as a historical preservation area. Such things are. Richard's face turned pale. "Dad's research was complete. He just died the day before he was going to announce it," Emily said calmly. "You benefited from Dad's death and hid his research. And you manipulated Mom to divert the foundation's money to your own plans." Natalie finally stood up and shouted at her mother, "You've been lying all this time? You were involved in Dad's death, too?" "Nat," her mother was at a loss for words. "I'm calling the police." David had already taken out his phone. Suddenly Richard shouted, "Don't come any closer," and picked up a knife from the table. The air in the room froze with tension. "Richard, stop!" her mother screamed. Emily, unflinching, looked into his eyes. It's over. Dad's death, your plans, everything will be revealed. I have nothing to lose, Richard said in a low voice. At that moment, sirens sounded in front of the house. Someone had called the police. The knife fell from Richard's hand, and he collapsed into a chair. Emily, her mother called out in a trembling voice. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was manipulated by Richard. Emily calmly replied, it's too late. She closed her father's laptop and clutched her father's pendant. I will protect Dad's honor, and the buildings he tried to protect with his life. As the sounds of police officers entering the house could be heard, Emily gazed at the continuing snow outside the window. Thanksgiving night had put an end to the family's long-kept secrets. It took 3 years for the truth to come to light. In her chest, sadness and a sense of release spread simultaneously. This was an end, but also a new beginning. Late autumn, 1 year later, Emily stood in front of an old brick building in the Old Mill District. A new copper plaque reading Jonathan Brown Historical Preservation Foundation shone on the front of the building. Your father would have been delighted to see this. Turning around, she saw Aunt Martha approaching with a smile. Emily nodded, clutching her father's pendant. Today is finally the opening ceremony, Emily said quietly. In her mind, the turbulence of the past year flashed like a slideshow. Richard had been indicted for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy charges, and was still on trial. His business empire had collapsed, and the land slated for development had been designated as a historical preservation area, based on her father's research findings. Mother Victoria, though an accomplice, had her sentence reduced for being under Richard's influence and cooperating with the investigation. She was now serving her days of atonement through community service. Since that night, the relationship between Emily and her mother remained broken, but at least they spoke on the phone once a month. Ready? David appeared with a document case in hand. The mayor has already arrived. Emily took a deep breath and answered, let's go. In the foundation hall, local people and those involved in historical preservation, quiet applause arose. Thank you all for gathering here today, she began in a calm voice. I am truly happy that this foundation can officially begin its activities, continuing the wishes of my father, Jonathan Brown. Among the audience, Emily found a familiar face. It was her sister Natalie. She was no longer in her former flashy appearance, but in a simple, elegant outfit, smiling modestly. After that incident, Natalie had left Richard's company and disappeared for a while. She had contacted Emily again 6 months ago. Now she was helping with the public relations of historical preservation activities, utilizing her social media skills. The rift between the sisters hadn't completely disappeared, but at least they could cooperate for a common purpose. After the speech, Emily walked over to Natalie. Thank you for coming, Emily said. How could I not? Natalie replied, seeming a bit embarrassed. It's the day Dad's dream comes true. Side by side, they gazed at the restored exhibit of their father's study. His research materials and beloved antiques were carefully arranged there. Have you heard from Mom? Natalie quietly asked. Emily nodded. She says she can't come for Thanksgiving. She doesn't seem ready yet. I guess that can't be helped, Natalie sighed. But at least she's still making amends. That alone. In Natalie's expression as she trailed off, Emily sensed a maturity she had never seen before. That incident had changed her sister significantly too. After the ceremony, Emily remained alone at the restored exhibit of her father's study. As she gazed at her father's possessions neatly arranged in glass cases, David approached with an envelope. I found this, he said. It seems to be your uncle's last letter. It's addressed to you and was hidden among his personal effects. With trembling hands, Emily accepted the envelope and took out the letter inside. Words written in her father's handwriting jumped out at her. To Emily. If anything happens, I think you'll be reading this letter. I know my research is in danger, but the truth will always come to light. I believe in you. You can protect this town's history. I love you. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks. Her father's words warmly resonated in her heart. Outside the window, snow had quietly begun to fall again. Thanksgiving was approaching once more. This time, it would be a holiday built on new bonds and truth. Emily held her father's pendant to her chest, gazing out the window. A family story of hurt, loss, and regeneration. She felt that this was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter.